A few years ago, I was having lunch with a client at the Four Seasons Hotel in Vancouver. And my mentor for almost 50 years, Joe Siegel, was also having lunch with a very distinguished man. Now, as I was leaving the restaurant, Joe summoned me over to meet his guest, and he introduced me to Monsignor Frederick Dolan, who is the vicar of Opus Dei of Canada. In just a few minutes, we seemed to hit it off, and we committed to stay in touch. He lives in Montreal, and of course, I live in Vancouver. And over the years, we have just done that. He's thoughtful, practical, compassionate, knowledgeable, a fantastic listener, and makes you feel you are the only person in the world when he's in discussion with you. He also provides meaningful and significant advice on a wide range of subjects and faithfully commits to pray for me, my family, and my staff and my company. And I appreciate that. He's been the vicar of Opus Dei for Canada since February 1998. He resides in Montreal and travels throughout much of Canada frequently. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1952, grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Literature in 1974 from Columbia University. And after 2 years in sales of Kaiser Steel Corporation in Oakland, California, he moved to Boston to pursue an MBA at Harvard Business School. His next stop was where he got to be Monsignor Dolan, and he worked as a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch way back in the days when Dow Jones was hovered at around 800 points. In 1980, he moved to Rome, Italy, to pursue an advanced studies in philosophy and theology. He was ordained to the priesthood by Pope John Paul II in June of 1983. After serving as chaplain of a student residence near the University of Notre Dame for several years, he worked at the U.S. headquarters of the prelate Opus Dei in New Rochelle, New York. His activities during that period included providing spiritual guidance to high school students in the Bronx and students at Yale University. And then in October 1992, he moved back to Rome to work at the Curia for Opus Dei. 5 years later, he returned to North America upon his appointment of Vicar of Opus Dei for Canada. And my guest today is Father Frederick Dolan. Father, welcome. Good to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Peter.
I've got some questions, but if you've got some things that you'd like to talk about, by all means, happy to do that. My first question is really, what do you consider is your greatest achievement in your life? Which is far from over, by the way.
That's it. I think I thank God every day for having discovered the spirituality of Opus Dei way back in 1969 when I was a high school kid, and then working all these years, it's a lot of years, in order to transmit that vision of integrating our faith and our work, our daily life. So I'd say that the greatest accomplishment is just seeing how that message has transformed many lives. And these days, after all these years, I keep getting messages from people saying, the advice you gave me 32 years ago and 42 years ago and whenever, it was the beginning of great things, because it is the beginning of great things.
So how did you acquire all this knowledge and this ability to listen carefully, which you do, to people you're talking to, and then respond to them in a meaningful and significant way?
I think part of it is just, I really am convinced that no matter who I'm talking with, there's a lot to learn. So I really try to listen carefully in order to see exactly what they're thinking. And if I'm not sure, then I keep asking questions till I get it. And then I think just over the years, there've been so many experiences that have sunk deep roots in me, so that as I'm speaking to someone and something comes up, I mention that. For example, now these days I'm giving a lot of thought to dads. I'm getting ready to prepare a conference for fathers. And I've been flooded by all these memories of my own father. And one of the points I'm going to make, because I love this point, is spend quality time with each of your children. Because I can remember after all these years, these small vignettes where I would go to the Stroh-Snyder's hardware store in Bethesda with my dad, or even something as simple. I had been living in Rome for a while. I went back to visit my parents and to renew my driver's license. So my dad said, well, let's go together. So we went to the Department of Motor Vehicles, took our number. It was a long, long line. We sat down in the waiting room. And as far as I was concerned, we could have been there for 3 hours. I would not have cared, because it was just the two of us, everyone else around us listening, but the two of us just communicating. And those things, those experiences have no price. And so I bring that to my conversations to these young dads.
So you must be an exceptionally attentive listener, which is not a quality I think I have. I like to think I have, but not to the same degree that you have. How does one acquire that ability to really listen to what somebody's saying and then offer your counsel or your advice or your suggestions?
You know, I think in part it comes from my parents, but I must say that over the recent years, just reading things written by Pope Francis, he's had a big impact on me, because he says, talking to married couples, he says, really listen and do not say anything until you are sure that the other person has said exactly what they're thinking. And until then, don't break the spell. But also, you know, I'll never forget this, my experience working as a stockbroker with Merrill Lynch a long time ago. In the training we got, they told us about how to ask questions. And then the point they made is, once you ask the question, you cannot be the one to speak the next. And even if the other person, there's silence for 30 seconds, which seems like an eternity, you can't break that spell. And if you wait that long, well, then whatever comes out of the other person's mouth really gives you an idea of where that conversation should go. I think that sank deep roots.
Is that an acquired trait and an acquired habit over the years?
I think so. I think it requires an awareness, an awareness that it's important to listen, and also respect. If you really respect the other person's dignity, and you listen and give them all the time they need, well, then great things happen. Whereas if you're there just waiting to cut them off because you want to make your point, you don't learn anything.
So what do you do in your spare time? Is there such a commodity for you of spare time?
Not too much lately, but you know, I work out a few times a week. Played golf, the first round of golf a couple of days ago, first round of the season. And just staying in touch with my friends takes up a fair amount of time. I love doing that. And what else do I do? I love reading. During the COVID, during the confinement, that has been pretty much it. But I can't wait to get back on the road, that's for sure.
So what would you do on the road? Well, what's a typical week for you on the road?
Well, one of the things I love to do is get together with small groups of people in order to converse. I'll give you an example. Whenever I go to Calgary or Vancouver, we organize what we call, well, basically it's a luncheon conference. I also do this in Ottawa. In fact, I do it wherever I go. But what we do is we provide sandwiches. We have it typically downtown in a boardroom somewhere. And we might have 10 or 12 people gathered around the board table. And while they're munching, I give maybe a 15-minute, 20 minutes at the most talk on some topic. It could be anything that will help them in their daily life. And then I finish, and then they all dive in and they say whatever they want. And the reason I love it is because in that kind of a context, they feel very comfortable staying at the level, the very spiritual level that we're talking about. So I'll give you a wonderful example that took place 2 years ago in Calgary. We were gathered around, and the topic was fortitude and how to deal with setbacks, because life is filled with setbacks. And I could tell as I was speaking that one of the gentlemen who was present, I could just, his body language said he was really connecting. So after I finished, I said, Peter, we're not going to continue until we find out exactly what you're thinking. It turns out that his son, the previous day, had been there with all of his buddies to watch the NFL draft, because Peter's son was sure he would be drafted. By the end of that evening, all his buddies left very quietly, and he was left in a bad place because he wasn't drafted. And so that story became a kind of a case study. We all started thinking, how can we help Peter? How can we help his son? So it was incredible. It was a magic moment. And those things happen quite often when you pick a topic that really resonates with the people who are there.
Yes. Well, what would you say is the biggest challenge you've faced?
I would say the biggest challenge is what we're facing right now. I've been giving a lot of thought to this lately. Thinking of the 18 to 35-year-olds. I hear from so many parents that their children or their grandchildren have not been baptized or have no interest in the faith. They're just off by themselves. So I've been thinking, how do you reach out to them and give them hand them a rope to bring them, to give them a vision of a much deeper approach to life. So what I've been thinking about, especially after talking with a 35-year-old the other day, he said, a lot of people these days are very lonely. With all the gadgets, everything, he said because of the way society has evolved, they don't know the world of relationships. I had never thought of it that way, but a 25-year-old who's grown up looking at a screen, and when he was in grade school or when she was in grade school, they would spend time recess, instead of playing, they would be on video games or that kind of thing. How do we help introduce them to the world of relationships? Because that is a key starting point for developing a relationship with God, obviously. So that kind of thing, I find it's daunting, and I find it fascinating. And just to finish up on that one, I've already produced a couple of approaches and sent them out to a half a dozen people and gotten a lot of feedback that I have found fascinating. So I'm still tweaking that message.
Okay. What is the one question that most people ask you more frequently than others?
Well, you mentioned Joe Siegel, whom I've known for 20 years now, which means I've known you for 20 years. He asked a question that a lot of people ask, which is, how far back did you become religious? So I end up talking about my parents, who were very spiritual, very religious. And just basically what that meant to me growing up. You know, the solidity, the marvelous, really the marvelous vision of life. So that when I was 16 and I came across the spirituality of Opus Dei, it was just a perfect continuity of learning how to apply my faith to my schoolwork back then, high school kid.
So what is your best memory as a high school kid when you were a lot younger than we are today?
Let's see, I think my best memory probably is, well, just coming in touch with these young men my age and watching them approach their studies in a very professional way. Well, and I should back up, because the very first time I went to a center of Opus Dei in Washington, we had a spiritual conference in the chapel, and we had dinner. Then we had a get-together. Now, high school kids don't have get-togethers, but we, in the living room, I'll never forget, I think we played charades. And I found the whole thing so intellectually stimulating and fascinating. And then watching these young men take their studies very seriously and learning how to do that myself, it was just opened up a whole new ballgame, whole new vision of life to me. And we're talking 1968, 69, and it's as though it were yesterday. And that says something.
So what would you say is your best memory from childhood? Your best memory of that you has stayed with you since then?
That's a real toughie. A lot of the memories have to do with my dad, well, my mother and my father. One that I'll never forget, it was a really hot summer day in Washington, which means, you know, sauna, bathing, 90 degrees and 90% humidity. And the garbage truck pulled up, and the men working there started to put our garbage into the truck. My dad walked out. My dad was unbelievably kind, thoughtful, generous. And so he walked over to these two men, and he said, could I offer you a cold bud? And of course they lit up, and he went into the refrigerator and brought out two Budweisers. And I'll never forget that. I mean, it's such a small thing, but it speaks volumes, let's put it that way. So many little things like that. My father was like everybody.
So over the years, what has become your best trait that God has inspired you to practice the most?
Well, I like to think, A, that I love to listen, and B, I love to talk to anybody. So quite often, you know, I'm walking on the street or at the airport. This happens quite often, as a matter of fact. I'll be at the airport. I always get there about an hour early because I know something's going to happen. I'm always dressed like this. And one example is I always pick a part of one of the gates where there are very few people sitting there, so I have plenty of space. So I was there with my little prayer book. And at one point, I could tell the corner of my eye that someone was approaching me. It was a woman who was about to catch a flight way up north. She said, Father, do you have a minute? I said, well, that's why I'm here. Please have a seat. So she was I think her mother was on her deathbed. This happened years ago, but she had to talk to somebody. And so I was in no hurry. My flight was an hour later. And I could tell that that conversation helped her. So when I'm walking on the street here in Montreal or wherever, I always try to look people in the eye, and sometimes you even catch someone looking back, saying hello, and great things can happen from that.
So who has been your role model over these years?
Well, I'd have to say the founder of Opus Dei, Saint Josemaria. who was canonized, declared a saint by John Paul II in 2002. So his whole approach to living one's faith and bringing it to bear on everything you do had a it had a profound impact on me. I met him in 1970. He died in 1975. So from that moment, from when I first came across this spirituality, this approach to living one's faith, it really took over. It flavored and colored everything that I do. So that kind of a life-changing event, it's at the top of the list.
So what would you say is the most happiest period of your life so far? Because it's far from over.
You know, I've often thought about that because at every stage of the game, I've had the attitude, I could stay here forever. When I was a chaplain at our student residence in South Bend, Indiana, I remember I was there, I'd been there for 3 years. And one day the head of Opus Dei in the United States was visiting. And he said to me, "How's it going?" I said, "I love it here so much, I could be here the rest of my life." And he just smiled. And 2 weeks later, I was in New York. And at every stage, the same thing has happened. In 1992, I moved to Rome, worked there at the headquarters. And in late 97, the head of Opus Dei in Rome, worldwide, called me to his office and he said, "Would you be willing to move to Canada?" And I said, I'll go anywhere. At that moment, I thought that I was in seventh heaven living in Rome. But here I've been here now for 23 years, and I'm almost afraid to say this, Gunnar, but I would be happy to stay here the rest of my life. Maybe 2 weeks from now, I'll be in Manila. I don't know, but I'd be happy. It's just the way the Holy Spirit works.
If you could change one thing about the world, big question, what would it be?
Unity. I would anything to get people to pursue unity rather than the direction that the society seems to be going right now, which is unbelievably divisive. The identity politics, and just everyone's going in the wrong direction. Whereas as I walk down the street, I see fellow human beings, brothers and sisters of mine. I don't see categories. I don't see division. I see unity. And if we could somehow find a way to squelch all this message of identity politics, it would be so great. But that's a tall order, that's for sure.
So my last question is really simple. What would you say to non-believers?
I would say, keep it really simple. Forget the institution, forget this great big thing called religion. Just think, okay, someone created us. His name is, we call this person God. And God has shown us how much he loves us by becoming human being, spending 33 years on earth. And at the end of that, he said, "I will be with you always." And he's just he would do anything to get us to respond to that love he has for us. And that's called faith. And that discovering God's love for us and then finding ways of discovering that and repaying that love, responding in the things we do every day, that changes everything. And that fills life with a much deeper meaning, a great deal of joy, and it also removes anxiety. Because if we're in God's hands, we're all set. A very loving Father.
That's very true. Is there anything that we can do out here on the West Coast that could be helpful to you?
One thing you can do as soon as I find a way of packaging my message to the 18 to 35-year-olds in a 15-minute little segment, I'll send that to you because you're such a gifted communicator. And because you have seen my previous attempt, the more feedback I can get, the more I can tweak what I'm trying to say in order to reach these young ones more effectively. That to me would be gold. I would just love that.
We will commit to do that. You have my word that when you send me the material, we will do that. But I might even get my wife in on that too, and Cherry as well.
That's great.
Yeah. So when do you plan next to come to Vancouver so we can break bread? And Joe was 96.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be before the end of the year, that's for sure. But
Okay.
no dates set yet.
Okay, good. Well, we got to have a three-way lunch. When I don't know where he's eating these days, because as you know, the Four Seasons is closed, and the restaurant no longer exists. But I still see him often and talk to him often, and he hasn't left his house for quite a few months because of COVID, obviously, and his age and whatever. But he's still active. He's still active and interested, and asked very, very pointed questions about where you're going, what are you doing, and how you're going to get there, that sort of thing.
That's Joe.
Yeah, that's Joe. This has been terrific. Thank you very much, Father. I appreciate it very much. I know you're a busy man, and for you to give us 15 to 20 minutes, it means a lot. So thank you so much.
Anytime, believe me.
Okay.